Chapter 8. American Manifest Destiny. You must conduct your government in the manner considered constitutional in accordance with the Anglo-Saxon theories of political science. Whether you like these theories or not, we understand that they are the best for you, and that our duty is to force you to follow them. H. W. Dodds. The United States and Nicaragua. Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, CTHRSE. 1927, p. 137. We do not want the vigor or moral force of our country to be exhausted, with endless meddling and mediation in all disputes, large and small, that afflict the world. Our ideal is to make America stronger, better, and higher, because only in this way, we believe, can it render the greatest service to world peace and the well-being of humanity. Cong Rec 66. Kong. First section. p. 3784. Albert K. Weinberg, stated that nationalism is rarely compatible with respect for the rights of others. Territorial expansion, national aggrandizement, tends to deteriorate unity and international peace. This expansionism, found in nationalism a powerful stimulus, was based on a moral ideology, which allowed this expansionism without feeling in a heretical position. The idea of a manifest destiny became general around 1820, while the idea of a destiny of the continental domain around 1840. It was believed in a natural law, the right of nature, derived from a natural law, eternal, universal of supreme obligation and dictated by God, as a moral justification for American expansionism. The first doctrine that reflected the nationalist theology of manifest destiny was the idea of a divine decree of independence. This doctrine was followed by another, the doctrine of a national mission that had lasting effects on later American nationalism. Franklin proudly stated that Providence would have assigned America a place of honor for fighting for the dignity and happiness of human nature. The humanitarian mission imposed by Providence seemed to have a double character. On the one hand, America was assigned the mission of perfecting democracy, the mission of applying the doctrine of natural rights to government. The accomplishment of this lofty task would allow America to be immediately, in Franklin's words, a kind of refuge for those who love freedom. Manifest Destiny p. 29. The development of democracy would also allow, as Nathan Fiske proclaimed, that freedom in turn extended its benign influence to the savage, enslaved, and ignorant nations, and thus reigned universally. Weinberg, 1968, p. 29. This national mission carries ideals of an international character. It was believed that all ancient empires had been built by conquest. However, the United States, this new empire, was founded on freedom and dedicated to the general cause of humanity. The territorial extension was related to national security, because its greater or lesser amplitude, respectively, allowed or would eliminate the adjacency of a dangerous enemy. In reality, this powerful desire for expansion, which is translated into contempt and hatred, are projected towards the rest of humanity, fearing that it will do the same with the expansionist empire. It must be assumed that if its expansion were to stop, another nation will be the one that will expand on the passive empire. Therefore, a constant expansionary activity must be maintained. The security and guarantee of the empire is supposed to be superior to the legal rights of other nations. Another natural right arises, the right to freedom. This right did not lend itself to expansionism. On the other hand, the other right that arose was provided, the natural right to security. Security claims broader political rights and justifies expansionism. Faced with the external threat, it refers to evil and the poison of other nations. But when it is the United States that attacks, it is justified because the empire is enabled by a natural law to security. The expansionist has as a consequence, an intense fear of being conquered, invaded, weakened, impaired. The conquering nation fears suffering the same damage that it produces. A third right, much broader than the first two, emerges, the natural right to the pursuit of happiness. Weinberg, 1968, p. 43. I consider the existence of a national behavior, that is, there are introverted, extroverted, authoritarian, dependent nations. Reading the history of moral justification allows us to appreciate the evolution of expansive American nationalism. We will see the authoritarian and alienated character trait in the behavior of this empire. On the one hand, national self-interest is manifested as international altruism. However, behind this altruism and concern to guide nations that cannot govern themselves, the policy of the good neighbor is transformed into the rationalization of a deep desire for power, domination, and hatred, with the ultimate goal of subjugating the weakest peoples militarily. This justification is hypocritical and insincere, and altruism does not take the form of self-denial, but of self-aggrandizement, in such a way that the growth of one can be done only at the expense of others, where the growth of a member of the community means the forced contraction of the other. American national morality is seen as self-sacrifice, but before international morality as self-aggrandizement. We can say that in the empire, inwardly there is an appearance of concern for the universal welfare of nations, however this concern outwardly has a utilitarian purpose, and that it points to oppression and dispossession. Albert Weinberg affirmed that manifest destiny represents an expansionist slogan by which all adjacent regions should be incorporated into the United States. This is assumed to be an unavoidable duty, a moral mission entrusted by God, fate, or a superior impersonal force. American expansionism is an ideology whose content can be exemplified although it is not exhausted by the ideas of manifest destiny. This expansionist ideology is a motley body of doctrines of justification, metaphysical dogmas on a certain providential mission, quasi-scientific laws relating to national development, concepts about national law and ideals about social duty, rationalizations, legal, and invocations to a higher law, purposes of spreading freedom and plans for the extension of a benevolent absolutism. Weinberg, 1968, p. 16. The American empire, while subduing the weaker nations, on the other hand submits to impersonal forces. This national behavior is characteristic of the authoritarian character. On the one hand it submits and on the other it submits to the design of a god, a manifest destiny or evident that the empire itself cannot explain because there is no rational elucidation. God has wanted it that way, and that is how it should be. However, and here is the detail that we want to underline, the authoritarian character is manifested through the bond, and therefore the submission, passivity, and submission of an other is needed. We must detail here that this freedom evasion mechanism manifests itself unconsciously. I have already mentioned the fallacy of a free empire, because by subduing other nations it has lost its freedom to bind and at the same time remain tied to bonds of dependency. Therefore the idea of freedom that both the American empire and the very nations that are linked to it have, whether of their own free will or not, is a fictitious idea of freedom, absolutely false. None of them is free, all are chained by forced bonds of dependency. Many nations also evade freedom by fearfully and passively submitting to empire, instead of seeking unity, the right commercial, economic, and political means to pursue freedom. Instead of attempting continental unity, they remain isolated from each other, thus contributing to imperial fortification. This ideology supposes that divine providence had decreed from before the foundation of this world the incorporation of all the regions adjacent to the United States. That mystery, inexplicable, impenetrable, enigmatic by which the divinity chose the empire to rule humanity, is the result of the historical transmutation of Puritanism and monotheocentric Calvinism, in the political philosophy of imperialism, which through unconscious mechanisms, and through long processes, it has transited from one state to the other. This philosophical and political mystery that has universally enthroned the empire above the nations, is the same mystery by which the Calvinist divinity cannot rationally explain how it is possible that Providence has decided to predestinate the world in two sectors, the one for salvation, and the other for damnation, and this divine decision has been established before the foundation of the world. Therefore I believe I have shown that the terms manifest destiny, or evident destiny, respond to historical transmutations built since the time of the Protestant Reformation, and are equivalent to the term political predestination, typical of Calvinist predestination. Despite considering itself the champions of democracy, the American expansionist ideology bears some similarity to the Nazi doctrine. Both are expansionist. Both consider that they are predestined to illuminate humanity by an impersonal force, call it God, the nation, divine providence, duty, destiny, the laws of nature, history. Both hate life. Both see themselves free and independent, when in reality they have evaded freedom by establishing bonds of dependency, subjugating other weaker nations, which are despised and loved simultaneously. Both are authoritarian, they are imbued with a sadistic yearning for power. The techniques of oppression are the same: militarism, warmongering, false advertising, lies, the imposition of fear, military intervention. Both celebrate the victory of the strongest and simultaneously oppression, predation, and even the extermination of the weakest. They both want to own everything, world domination, have absolute control over everything and everyone. Both have strong tendencies towards racism, xenophobia, sexism. Both consider themselves a superior culture. Both rationalize the appetite for power, stating that they do so for the sake of culture and democracy worldwide. Both claim to fight for peace and freedom. Their attempts at domination are not interpreted as oppression, but rather acts of defense against those who wish to dominate. As we have seen, both are inspired by the social Darwinian theory of survival of the fittest. Although Darwin did not express so openly, although he did, a doctrine of a racist nature, the social Darwinism interpreted by Spencer and Bagehot, built a different reality. Both express the same thing: they seek the benefit of humanity, while their enemies oppose such a remarkable undertaking. At the end of the 19th century, and the beginning of the 20th, a generation of young intellectuals arose: Manuel Ugarte, Eduardo Prado, Cesar Zumeta, José Enrique Rodo, José María Vargas Vila, Rufino Blanco Fombona, Santos Chicano, Jaime Freire, Leopoldo Diaz, among others, who saw the threat of a possible U.S. protectorate on our continent, the fear of armed intervention, the policy of Roosevelt's Great Cudgel, and its corollary through which the Monroe Doctrine's right of interference was established, its validity as an instrument of economic and political domination. The autonomy and future of the great homeland of Ugarte were threatened. I want to remember this generation of the 900, valuing their love of freedom, their integrity, their sense of responsibility and commitment to future generations among which we are part. Rodo addresses the youth of our continent, urging them to abandon Anglo-American utilitarianism, life without purposes, without ideals, to value the love of life, of freedom, rejecting the dogma of the triumph of the strongest and of imperialism, to prevent the assimilation of the Yankee culture in the continent and not being impressed by the lights that emanate from this empire, nor by its siren songs. I will transcribe the expressions of José Enrique Rodo that appear in the pamphlet of Juan José López Silveira, in Yankee Imperialism in Latin America, 1961, on the interventionist policy of the United States, written in 1915, where the United States proposed to interfere in the Revolution Mexican agrarian as an exemplary measure for the other countries of our continent. The government of the United States of the North, according to telegraphic information in recent days, has proposed to the consideration of the diplomatic representatives of the Latin American nations before that country the continental convenience that could exist in a joint action of the American peoples to intervene in the unfortunate internal situation in Mexico and seek a solution that normalizes it. As a country included among those that have been the object of this very delicate consultation, it is important to us that the cooperation of our diplomacy in the deliberations to which it gives rise is inspired by serious reflection and takes into account all the complexity of interests, moral and material, which affects for the entire America, and uniquely for us, the consideration of this proposal. In principle, all foreign intervention in the internal affairs of a sovereign state, especially when these matters do not have de facto complications that directly harm the immunities or dignity of other states, must be excluded and repudiated with resolute energy, making such exclusion one of the essential foundations of all American international politics. Accepting transactions or condescension in the application of this principle, would mean a very serious precedent, which, more than anyone else, should alarm the nations of small territorial extension, condemned, if that criterion is allowed, to the affront of outside interventions, provided that the appreciation, fair or unfair, of its powerful neighbors believed the opportunity to interfere in their internal disputes had arrived. The international policy of the United States of the North has known antecedents, in terms of its interference in the domestic affairs of the peoples of this continent. The purpose of intervention that is now being hinted at, would in any case be logical and consistent with that historical orientation of North American policy, but for the other peoples of the New World, consulted with courteous office, there is an opportunity to resolve whether they have to cooperate, directly or indirectly, to the development of an international norm that tends to establish, in America, something like a protective and philanthropic guardianship of the strong and orderly over the weak and unruly. That, validating the superiority of its strength, the powerful northern nation has executed its unmasked interventions, as in Cuba and Panama, and exercises a constant and covert intervention in the public affairs of other Spanish-American states, is not a great disservice to the other republics of the continent, if it is considered that an international action proportionate to the means and resources of its enormous neighbor is not justly required of them. But that all this is going to continue and be completed with the express consent and complacent collaboration of the peoples of Latin America themselves, is an aberration that could never be apologized and against which the governments consulted must seriously prevent themselves in order to shape the interventionist purpose of that is spoken. In everything that has been said, we refer to any kind of material intervention, to any interference that has the way of manifesting the cooperation of foreign forces in favor of one or other of the parties that dispute the government in Mexico. We do not allude to the interventions of a moral nature, consisting of the good offices that can be offered for the solution of the dreadful crisis, with the purpose of conciliation and on the indeclinable basis of the spontaneous and express conformity of the people torn by civil war. The former is radically unacceptable, the second would be due to a feeling of continental solidarity, and even more, humanitarian solidarity, that could only arouse support and applause, but care must be taken that the line that separates these friendly interventions from those depressing impositions is not crossed in the slightest. José Enrique Rodo, El Telegrafo, Montevideo, August 4, 1915. On the other hand, let us remember the Argentine Manuel Ugarte, the forerunner of the anti-imperialist struggle in our great homeland, who as a prophet, and before the outbreaks of the great imperialist wars saw in advance the expansionist and destructive Yankee danger. That great homeland mentioned by Ugarte, footnote, Ugarte, Manuel. 1960. La Patria Grande. Buenos Aires, editorial Coyoacán. It was also the ideal of Simon Bolívar, San Martin, Castelli, Moreno, and Monteagudo. End of footnote. Manuel Ugarte wrote more than 40 volumes and yet he could never have the satisfaction in life of seeing only one of his works published in his own country. It was not until 1953 that the editorial Indo-Americana reissued El Porvenir de América Latina. Ugarte denounced the imperialist action, and advocated the national unity of our disunited republics, and finally died in 1951 without seeing only one of his texts published in Argentina. The great warlike and arrogant power of the American Empire paralyzed the opponents, generated fear in the spirit of the subjugated and weaker nations, producing as a consequence a strong resistance to confrontation and national disobedience. This fear, generally unconscious, is often translated as submission, resignation, imitation, indifference, and even admiration for the aggressor, putting a mute on the discourses of freedom and national sovereignty. Building a naive interpretation of the aggressor, by denying his expansionist and interference intentions. This disinterest in knowing, in deepening, and understanding, speaks to us of resistance to opposition and change. Deep down, the intentions of the aggressor are well known, but they are muted to remain absent from any implication, and avoid the anxiety generated by defending national sovereignty from the colossal expansionist tyranny of the aggressor. The result of this is submission, inaction, and the establishment of bonds of dependency. Admiration for the aggressor, denial of his expansive violence, and fear of his destructive power are manifested simultaneously. It is a very difficult task to admire the aggressor, without suspecting at any time, and without ever realizing his blatant arrogance, plunder, interference, racial hatred, interventionism, death, and expansionist destruction. It draws our attention that even many intellectuals with a deep capacity for self-scrutiny, come to the degree of admiring the forces that attack their own nations, their fellow citizens, and as if that were not enough, these same intellectuals wrap themselves in the flags of the colonizing powers that subjugate their own nations. While it is true that this behavior can respond to economic interests, we do not deny that at the same time it responds to a deep and irrational fear towards that same admired aggressor. Certain convictions, which we vigorously defend, are often built on fear. We live them as ours, when in reality they are imposed from the outside. How can we ignore the Monroe Doctrine, the doctrine of manifest destiny, the interference of the empire breaking into our nations, the coups d'état that they have organized jointly with the military forces of our own nations, and the death that they have caused in our peoples? What people can be capable of brandishing the aggressor's flag and at the same time their own national flag, knowing that their people have been killed, persecuted, humiliated, and plundered by that aggressor whose flag flies in his hands? Fear of the aggressor frequently leads to denial of the aggressor. There is no aggressor, there is no aggressor, they are lies, lies, of some who want to instill fear in us. This denial is manifested as a defense mechanism, of resistance. Deep down the existence of an aggressor is not accepted. Any attempt at questioning is suppressed and an additional interpretation is given in which the aggressor reappears as a protector. However, fear and even hostility towards the aggressor often remain repressed, interpreting him as an ally rather than an enemy, and renouncing confrontation to join his expansionist claims. The decolonizing analysis, and his dimensional understanding through the study of historical processes under unconscious interpretation will help us to glimpse even more the colonizing influence. The study of the unconscious will reveal to us an arcane dimension about the genuine causes, generally rationalized, repressed or denied, which are very difficult to detect from the conscious surface. We can live in a secularized environment, and at the same time completely ignore that we are being affected by centuries-old forces, whose mystical contents have been successively integrated into various substitute knowledge. Colonial expansionist thinking is permeated with a deep hatred of life, with compulsive forces where it is not possible to stop, where it is desired to possess more, and where nothing obtained is enough. Its industrialized concept of time tends to see existence quickly, judging other nations as static, passive, childish. It is necessary to have it all, to possess it all, to expand the territorial limits further and further until it encompasses the whole world if possible. Nothing can satisfy the inordinate and rampant appetite for power and possession. If this expansive process is stopped, there is an imminent danger that other nations will take its place. Therefore it is necessary to keep the flame of expansion alive to avoid the expansion of another above us. Expansionist ideologies are permeated with deep hatred, racism, xenophobia, contempt, opposing any attempt at unity and harmony between the weaker nations. He holds up everything that represents power, possession, and feels a deep contempt for defenseless minorities, for poverty, for diversity, for the most unprotected and vulnerable men and women. He presents opposition and fear to the search for unity of the nations to which he wants to see them disintegrated and in constant confrontation, in order to subjugate them in isolation. Altruism takes the form of self-aggrandizement, and the physical extension of the territory acquires a moral justification. Expansionism takes on a manifestation of international altruism. Chapter 9. Joseph Needham and Eurocentrism. Universal modern science, yes. Western science, no. Joseph Needham. History is built through a continuous process where the development of certain discoveries would be sterile, without the prior existence of other events. If Galileo had not created his heliocentric theory, and Darwin his theory of the evolution of species, Freud could not have created psychoanalysis. A previous historical development was needed to serve as a basis to build on it, new elements. There is no civilization that has developed technologically by itself, without having received external influences. We often interpret beliefs and practices other than our own as alien, inferior, wild, and absurd. The researcher should not feel sympathy or rejection of the objective of his study, which in both cases causes anxiety. We must learn to observe ourselves, instead of resisting being observed, to understand this historical process that is being built on the basis of previous elements. We can affirm that the English scientist, Joseph Needham, perhaps, unknowingly and unwillingly, contributed to destabilizing Eurocentrism. Needham was born in London in 1900. He studied biochemistry and held various university positions. In 1942 he went to China as head of the British scientific mission, dedicating himself to the study of Chinese culture and civilization. In 1954 Needham and his collaborators began the publication of Science and Civilization in China, a monumental encyclopedic work. Both Griffiths and Needham were English, and they belonged to the same expansionist power that had plundered the East and in a general sense many geographical areas on all continents. Griffiths lived in India, and Needham in China, the former fusing Catholicism with Hindu religions, and the latter studying Chinese science and technology. Needham affirms that during the first 15 centuries of our era, the Chinese civilization stayed far ahead of Europe in the scientific and technological field, and that the discoveries made in the East passed to the Western world. Both the printing press, gunpowder, the magnetic compass, iron casting, clockwork, canal locks, the Kodas rudder or quantitative cartography, are examples of Chinese influence in Europe. Needham spent 30 years in China, together with a group of Chinese scientists, and from here the two questions arise. Why did modern science achieve a meteoric boom only in the West during the time of Galileo? 2 before our era, and the 16th century after our era, was East Asian culture much more effective than Western European in its application of knowledge of nature for practical purposes? Needham, 1977, p. 17. The decimal value depending on the position and blank space for 0, was first used in the land of the Yellow River. The same is true of the metric decimal system. The use of decimal graduated sliding gauges took place around the 1st century BC. During the Sung and Yuan eras, 12th to 14th centuries AD, the Chinese school was at the forefront of the rest of the world in solving equations, in such a way that the so-called Pascal's triangle was already old in China at the beginning of the century. 14. The articulated pivoting ring system known as the Cardinaux suspension was commonly used in China 1,000 years before the time of Cardinaux. The Chinese also observed space long before the European Renaissance, mapped the sky using our modern coordinates, and described eclipses, comets, novae, and meteors. In the field of astronomy, Tycho Brahe introduced in the 16th century the montage and the equatorial coordinates already used previously in China. This had been inspired by Arab astronomical books, and the Arabs knew it from the Chinese. They invented the equatorial assembly, the clockwork mechanism, they knew seismology. The Chinese scientist Chang Hung was the one who built the first seismograph around 130 AD. Since the 11th century, small amounts of a variola pustule have been inoculated into the nose of the patient to be immunized. He had advanced optics, acoustics, magnetism, topography, geology, meteorology, mechanical engineering, and engineering in general, hydraulic power for industrial purposes, and not so much for the milling of cereals, the smelting of iron, and 15 centuries earlier than in Europe. Similarly, mechanical watchmaking began not in Europe of the early Renaissance, but in China of the Tang dynasty. Suspension bridges made of iron chains and the first structure with a segmental arch were built. Hydraulic engineering, defense against floods and droughts, irrigation, and grain transportation. The appearance of firearms took place in the 9th century of our era. At the beginning of the 12th century of our era, the Chinese created the fire lance that consisted of an explosive mixture enclosed in a bamboo tube that was used as a weapon. From this invention he derived the weapons of the type of bombs and cannons. Silk, the transmission belt and chain transmission, the manufacture of paper, printing, blocks, and movable type and porcelain were important. The Chinese knew about the biological control of insect pests, and they were advanced in inoculation techniques. Before the Europeans knew polarity, the Chinese were already concerned with magnetic declination. The magnetic compass was Chinese, created in the Song period, around the year 1044. When we review this list of forms of scientific activity, it is difficult to understand how anyone can deny them their status as essential components of fully developed world science, biological and chemical as well as astronomical and physical, if it is not in the interest of some instinctivist side. Needham, 1977, p. 46. There is nothing from Greece, no document that is of vital interest to radio astronomers, instead only the lists of novae, comets, and meteors of Chinese officials astronomers, who were the ones who established the constant law in the 7th century, Shangset, by which the tail of comets point away from the sun. The Renaissance astronomers who argued so much among themselves about the priority of the study of sunspots, would have been embarrassed if they had known that they had been observed in China since the 1st century BC, and not only observed, but recorded in documents, carefully transmitted. When Kepler wrote his New Year's letter on the hexagonal shape of snow crystals in 1611, he did not know that his contemporary Xi Caihang was investigating the exact same thing, not as a new idea, but as a well-known fact, and discussed since Han Ying's original discovery in the 2nd century BC. When we look for the original roots of the cloud formation process in comparing snow crystals with those of various salts and minerals, we find them not in Wilke's experiments in the 18th century, but in Chu Shi's keen observations in the 12th century. It is a remarkable fact, as we have already seen, that the Chinese were concerned with the cause of magnetic declination long before Europeans even knew of magnetic orientation, and seismographs were only known in post-Europe. Renaissance. Needham, 1977, pages 47 to 48. Needham also affirms that the same happened with the seismograph, which was used in China from the 2nd to the 7th centuries of our era, and that was unknown in Europe, being reinvented in the post-Renaissance period. These Chinese inventions were transmitted to Europe. The consequences left by the printing press, the gunpowder, and the magnet were very important, changing the world from the field of literature, war, and navigation respectively. The creation of firearms was of Chinese origin, and its beginnings date back to the end of the Tang, in the 9th century of our era. Needham believes that it remains a mystery, how these discoveries were passing to the West. It assumes that it traveled by land through the Tatar kingdoms, and not across the sea, and that the transmissions to Europe were arriving in waves, that is, at certain times. The concept of magnetic attraction had great importance in the cosmic role of magnetism, gravitation, the parallelism between gravity and magnetism, and in the ideas of Gilbert, Kepler, and Isaac Newton. These Chinese discoveries, the compass, paper, gunpowder, the printing press among many others, were of vital importance in the initial phases of modern science, so much so that the compass allowed the circumnavigation of the African continent, and the arrival to the New World. As for the advancements in the domain of iron and steel, which allowed the construction of bridges and deep drilling of wells up to 2,000 feet deep, and the first oil wells in the southwestern United States, were drilled with the techniques that were used in China. Before the Western so-called Iron Age, there was an Iron Age in China. Needham states that until the end of the 14th century no European had seen a cast iron ingot, when in China, this had already been achieved 18 centuries earlier. Archaeological excavations made it possible to discover many cast iron instruments from the 4th century BC. Europeans mistakenly believed that China was not a maritime people, and Hegel, compelled by a strong feeling of contempt for everything that did not represent Northern Europe, full of prejudices, arrogance and a deep ignorance of science and technology, China, knowledge that was notably enriched a century later, dared to affirm that the ship, an oceanic swan that, with its swift movements and elegant curves, crosses the plane of the waves or draws perfect circles on it, is an instrument whose invention honors the audacity no less than the intelligence of man. This breadth of the Navy, this transcending of terrestrial limitations is completely lacking in the magnificent edifice of Asian states even when they border the sea, such as China. For them the sea is the cessation of the land. These states have no positive relationship with the sea. Hegel, 1994, p. 169. Joseph Needham and Gavin Menzies claim that the Chinese have been called a non-maritime people with utter injustice. Medieval merchants and missionaries witnessed the existence of a large number of boats built with bamboo, which plowed its inland waters. Needham claims that between 1100 and 1450 his deep-sea fleet was the largest in the world. The Chinese fleet sailed from Kamchatka to Madagascar, and Menzies claims that the Chinese fleets circumnavigated the Earth, before the Spanish reached our continent. Studying ancient maps and nautical charts, Menzies concluded that the Chinese first arrived in the Caribbean islands of Puerto Rico and Guadeloupe, some 70 years before Columbus arrived in the Caribbean. I was amazed to discover that Patagonia and the Andes had been mapped a century before the first Europeans spotted them, and even Antarctica had been accurately drawn some 4 centuries before Europeans reached the continent. Another map showed the eastern coast of Africa in perfectly correct lengths, something that Europeans would not be able to do for another 3 centuries. Australia appeared on another map 3 centuries before Cook, while still others showed the Caribbean, Greenland, the Arctic, and the Atlantic and Pacific coasts of both North and South America, long before Europeans arrived there. To have mapped the entire world with such accuracy, these explorers, whoever they were, had to have circumnavigated the globe. They must have mastered astronomical navigation, and they must have discovered a method of determining longitude that would allow them to draw those maps with practically negligible longitude errors. Menzies, 2017. Between the 1st and 15th centuries of our era, Chinese science and technology were far superior. With the beginning of the European Renaissance and the Galileo Revolution, European science and technology began to grow rapidly over the next 300 years and then compensated. Needham affirms that in the development of the Chinese society, a drastic change did not happen as it manifested from the European Renaissance and with the Galileo Revolution. From there, Europe began to grow rapidly, surpassing the levels of Asian societies. However, this speed should not confuse us, in such a way that we ignore the contributions of Asian civilizations, taking into account that science as such was not characteristic only of Europe, and that what developed in many non-European societies was really science, and not just technology as some sinologists still believed. However, all these discoveries failed to impose on China the speed that manifested itself in Europe since the Renaissance, due to the capitalist revolution, and the Reformation, since technical or commercial innovation cannot by themselves cause these structural changes. On the other hand, the people of China needed little or nothing from the outside. According to Needham, the concept of wealth had no value in China. It provided comfort, but it did not provide wisdom. Therefore, opulence carried little prestige. In the same way they used argumentation instead of imposing force, because they assumed that violence was always the wrong way of doing things. I think it is very important to emphasize that after the Second World War, and thanks to the social interest in Eastern mysticism, the West was enriched by experiencing vitalist thinking. Biologists, psychoanalysts, anthropologists, philosophers, historians, they changed the way of interpreting reality. After the Great Wars, alternatives were sought, different ways of thinking, that would lead us towards a more peaceful and just civilization, trying to prevent these world conflicts from emerging again. The dominant European and American system over the colonial territories was questioned. Colonialism, fascism, racism, authoritarianism were fought, in favor of freedom, and for the independence of nations subjected by the tyranny of the hegemonic powers. Workers, farmers, students, carried out strikes, work stoppages, street protests, factory occupations, and barricades. Eastern thought was resorted to from culture and science, as a possibility of change, of alternative, seeking diverse thought, unity between beings and nature, the rejection of violence and militarism, the encounter with the protective mother faced with the response of a violent, monotheocentric father. Joseph Needham was one of these countless Orientalist scientists. Before the emergence of these protest movements, that is, in the period between the two wars, he did work on developmental biochemistry, before dedicating his life to the study of Chinese history. It is interesting that from the beginning he defended the mechanistic paradigm, changing his way of interpreting reality, around 1935, to embrace the organicist point of view. Later he left biology, to become one of the most eminent historians of Chinese science, and a defender of the organicist vision that constitutes the foundation of Chinese thought. The Viennese scientist Fritjof Capra stated that the changes brought about by modern physics have been widely discussed during the last decades by both physicists and philosophers, but on rare occasions it has been observed that they all seem to lead in the same direction, towards a vision of the world that is very similar to which Oriental mysticism presents. The concepts of modern physics often show striking parallels with the religious philosophies of the Far East. Although these parallels have not yet been fully exploited, they were noticed by some of the great physicists of our century, when, on the occasion of their conferences in India, China, and Japan, they came into contact with the culture of the Far East. We will see how the two pillars of 20th century physics, quantum theory and relativity theory, force us to see the world in the same way that a Hindu, a Buddhist, or a Taoist sees it, and we will also see how that the similarity gains strength when we look at recent attempts to combine the two theories, in order to achieve an explanation for the phenomena of the submicroscopic world, the properties and interactions of the subatomic particles from which all matter is made. In this field, the parallels in Oriental mysticism are more than surprising, and we will often stumble upon claims that it will be almost impossible to tell whether they were made by physicists or by Oriental mystics. Capra, N.D., p. 6. Of English origin, Joseph Needham was the most original scientist of universal culture, a professor at the University of Cambridge. He is the highest universal authority as a connoisseur of ancient Chinese civilization. During the 40 years that he lived in this country, he wrote a monumental 12-volume work which he called Science and Technology in China. Science did not appear in a flash. Nor did it develop in a particular region of the planet. It was a long evolutionary process that did not begin with the Greeks or spread in a linear fashion until it reaches our days. As Joseph Needham points out, most of the inventions developed in the Western world had been created in China and then passed to the West through the Islamic region and trade routes. The casting of metals, the printing of interchangeable types, the astronomical clock, medicine, chemistry, firearms, boats powered by paddle wheels, the drilling of deep wells, the mechanical clocks created 6 centuries before the Europeans, moxibustion, astronomy, and sunspot observation. They explained the biological origin of fossils, the theory of the evolution of species, alchemy, vaccination, and an infinity of inventions were created in China for more than 1,000 years. The invention of paper was developed by the Chinese in the year 100, and the printing press in the year 700. As we see, human inventions are the product of a universal construction, of thousands of creative microprocesses, and not of a specific civilization. Needham states that the peoples of Asia have been at different times in their history, the main architects of evolutionary progress included there, the area of man's scientific dominion over nature. However, Europeans, puffed up with pride by their relatively recent scientific achievements, have decided to ignore the extent to which their intellectual hegemony has relied on techniques and ideas invented by supposedly inferior races. Needham, 1978, p. 24. The main disciple of Confucius, Mencius, maintained as a basic point of his doctrine the fundamental goodness of human nature. Just as within the Western Christian tradition Augustine represents orthodoxy and Pelagius the heresy, in China Mencius was the orthodox disciple and Sun Tzu the heterodox. The thought of these authors also reached Europe in the 18th century, and we know how profound was the influence it exerted on the encyclopedist movement, the one in charge of laying the theoretical premises of the French Revolution and of all subsequent progressive naturalist ideologies. Some researchers claim that many inventions such as the compass, paper, gunpowder, printing, etc. they were invented in China during the 14th and 15th centuries, and that Europe subsequently applied. Francis Bacon said that the compass, gunpowder, paper, and printing were invented by Europeans, however they were first discovered by the Chinese. The Chinese tradition must be understood internally before giving an answer as to why China did not experience the equivalent of our Western scientific revolution. In China, for example, a Euclidean geometry and a Ptolemaic planetary astronomy were lacking, but China laid the foundations for the study of magnetic phenomena, an essential precursor of later electrical science. In addition, Chinese culture was impregnated with conceptions much more organic and less mechanistic than Western culture. Moreover, only Chinese culture contributed the materialistic conception of the elixir of life that, when passing to Europe through the Arabs, led to the macrobiotic optimism of Roger Bacon and the iatrochemical revolution of Paracelsus, both of which for the origins of modern science. They were as important as the work of Galileo and Newton. Needham, 1978, p. 365. Needham claims the Chinese sunspot record from the 1st century BC. To that in the year 1300 DC Qutb al-Din al-Shirazi has correctly explained the rainbow. Chapter 10. Social Darwinism in our continent. The questioning of Eurocentric thought, and of biological determinism has been a difficult and even unthinkable task. How can he question the natural and intellectual capacity of the European, an inferior being from an exotic distant continent? It was believed that the South American countries should not interbreed with inferior races, otherwise a great civilization would not be produced on the continent. Gabriel Terra openly expressed his contempt for the Criollo, and the Indian. In Brazil, we have the naturalism of Arruda Furtado and his work The Man and the Macaque, the doctor and anthropologist Francisco Ferraz de Macedo, J.B. Lacerda, the sociologist Euclides de Cunha and the Rebellion of the Canados, the anthropologist Raimundo Nina Rodrigues, and his work Human Races and the Responsibility of Brazil, Ladislao Neto, director of the National Museum of Brazil, the anthropologist Oliveira Martins, and his Element of Anthropology. Natural History of Man, the anthropologist Gilberto Freire, and his work Casa Grande y Centella. In Mexico, José Vasconcelos, the anthropologist Manuel Gamio, the economist Gilberto Loyo, Alfredo Saavedra. In Chile, the socialist Salvador Allende Gossens in his work Mental Hygiene and Crime. In Argentina, Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, Alejo Peyret, José Ingenieros, Juan Bautista Alberti, in their bases and starting points of the Argentine Republic, the Uruguayans José Pedro Varela and Javier Gamencero among many others. As we see, across the Atlantic, Spencer's social Darwinism prolonged his influence on intellectual thought. Artists, philosophers, scientists, politicians, and educators such as José Pedro Varela, and Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, who, despite their contributions, continued to believe the fallacy of the racial superiority of Spencer's social Darwinism. The nations of our continent had begun their process of independence. This situation had to be strengthened, especially in Uruguay, a small nation, since its independence continued to be threatened, both from the inside and the outside. The need for strengthening had to be consolidated by force or by industrial and economic development. At that time a large and foreign population lived in the country, investors, whose interests were alien to the nationality and economy of the young nation. If these investors failed to satisfy their interests, whether made impossible by the continuous internal conflicts or by the civil war under the government of Lorenzo Battle, it was feared that they would undermine the national goals achieved, and against the population that had politically separated from the colonial powers, before which these foreigners identified themselves. The fear of European intervention was constant. The conviction was held that progress was hampered by interference and contamination with inferior non-European races, whose interbreeding with the superior races was considered a chimerical dream. Beyond the importance of the Verlaine reform for Uruguay, we must briefly expose the character structure of the reformer José Pedro Varela, who had a certain ambivalence regarding power. On the one hand, it understands that colonization has not always been done in a peaceful way by the Anglo-American, the French and the Spanish. He also admits the cruelties and the death of Atahualpa, Moctezuma, and the disgrace of the name of Pizarro and Cortez, but despite this, he consents that these are no more, in a certain way, than acts of individual savagery, which can be opposed to that of the Indians themselves. Varela, 1964, p. 155. Influenced by the spread of European and American racism, he insists that it is necessary to look elsewhere for the cause of the gradual disappearance of the Redskins, and that cause can only be the struggle for existence, which in the same environment makes the weakest species disappear fatally before the best endowed species, the species that does not work, before the one that works, the species, in short, that needs to live on too large an extension of territory, before that for which an extension reduced to the minimum is enough. Varela, 1964, p. 155. It was necessary to civilize the Indian, that is, to impose the European culture on him, hoping that he would gradually abandon the wild life to adopt an obedient life, thus being docile to the teaching of the schoolmaster and the pastor. Varela, 1964, p. 156. Education existed as a function of European assimilation and dependence. Varela celebrates the submission and cultural loss of the Cherokees and Creeks to American expansionist culture, while, on the other hand, interpreting dependency as an act of development and civilization. He opposes the fight for freedom, resistance, and cultural defense against expansionism, rejecting the decision of the other Redskins, who do not seem to absolutely want to follow in the footsteps of their intelligent predecessors. Varela, 1964, p. 157. Inspired by the theory of survival of the fittest, Europeans and Americans celebrated at the same time that the savage had to gradually die out due to their own inferior nature, compared to the racial superiority of the European man. And the main reason is always that great natural law of the struggle for existence. The two races, the red and the white, would not know how to coexist side by side. The one, it has been said, is developed by working the soil, the other is destroyed by not wanting to conform to that culture. Varela, 1964, p. 157. According to Bagehot, the diseases of the European man were a natural and biological mechanism of the superior race to eliminate the inferior race, what today we understand as a chemical weapon. It was understood that the decline of the savages in the United States was due to the demands of this natural law. The theorists of these Darwinian ideas projected their hatred on the existence of the original nations. There is between the two races something like an instinctive repulsion, like a natural antipathy that does not allow one to unite fraternally with the other. In the entire expanse of the United States, there is only one truly civilized Indian to be cited, General Parker, and even he is a mestizo. What happens with Redskin has to do with black. In all our travels we have heard nothing more than a really educated Negro who spoke and wrote well. He is Leslet Geoffroy, whom several living Creoles have still known. He was from the island of Mauritius, mulatto, although he had black skin and hair. He understood physical and natural sciences, topography, and was appointed correspondent member of the Paris Academy of Sciences. This example is the only one of its kind with which it can be argued, and still nothing proves, since the subject was of mixed blood. Varela, 1964, p. 159. Deep down, captive by the Eurocentric and racist ideology, José Pedro Varela considers submission and the bonds of dependency, opposition, and freedom. A submissive, subordinate education, based on a deep contempt for the incapable and inferior because of a natural law that controls everything and for what he understood and unconditionally accepted as civilization, progress, and development, as he had learned and accepted without daring to question these ideas. We must not doubt the great importance that the Verlaine reform had for Uruguay. However, our reformer could not free himself from certain thoughts typical of his time and culture. This reality is what all of us in one way or another experience. We cannot ask everything from the most critical reformer, nor from the most enlightened scientist, nor from the most revolutionary politician. We will not be able to totally question certain underground aspects of our culture, because to some extent all of us are involved with a way of interpreting the world and our reality, in such a way that it is very difficult to reach all the unconscious and paradigmatic aspects. We cannot question what we cannot perceive, something that has not yet passed the threshold of consciousness. However, what we fail to notice, question and therefore change, the following generations will have that possibility because they are less emotionally involved. The new generations will have to value the scope of the previous generations beyond certain rudimentary aspects, because thanks to the previous scope, the later generations were inspired to continue the process of change. That of a historian investigating the Renaissance will not have the same emotional charge as one who speaks of a contemporary historical event, typical of his time and space, with which he was deeply involved, and whose emotions gain intensity. To the extent that a historical event is emotionally rooted in present situations, even if this event belongs to a remote past, it will continue to produce anxiety in the subject involved. As anxiety becomes more intense, the ability to interpret will lose analytical depth. Remember that we can only observe events in the observer. The production of critical thinking is essential to generate social changes, however we must bear in mind that we are making this criticism from a different worldview. While it is true that we should not make value judgments about the observed culture, that does not prevent criticism of that society. The difference between extemporaneous value judgment and virtual criticism lies in the awareness of space and time that separates us from the observed facts. We must understand that the extemporaneous value judgment is hasty, it judges without taking into account the social and cultural context. On the other hand, virtual criticism is careful. It understands the events of the past, it does not judge them, it understands that they occurred in a different worldview, but at the same time admits a change. If we seek social change, we must be critical of past events to build other ways of interpreting reality. To the extent that culture understands the value of the human and the genuine content of the term civilization, it will be able to glimpse the importance of hope, love of life, the underdog, responsibility for the other, for their care and growth. We must bear in mind that if we had lived in a past social context, it would be very possible that we would have had the same ideas that we judge harshly from our present social context. In the same way, if we could look at our present from the future, we would become our own critics. Even in the same social context, uniform thinking is not possible. Thanks to critical thinking, great social changes are due. Criticism of a foreign worldview will present less countertransference resistance than being critical of ours. The analysis made by a subject from his own culture will produce greater anxiety, and therefore less possibilities to understand it, to decipher it, interpret it, and describe it. Being more involved because it is his own culture, he will experience greater anguish, countertransferential resistance, distorting the interpretation of contemporary events, which tend to distort. The issue of racial superiority becomes the leitmotif in the thought of Domingo F. Sarmiento. The teacher considered that the different races represented different stages of human evolution, that is, it is assumed that the Caucasian race reached a biological evolutionary level much higher than the indigenous race and in a broad sense, all other non-European races. It was assumed that this combative superior race must necessarily make the inferior race disappear, and that the European white man had won, imposing himself on the other inferior races. The conquest of America could be achieved because one race superior defeated another inferior race. One of the great mistakes made was to reduce what was considered progress to purely technological issues. Society did not realize that this progress can advance from a technological dimension, and at the same time go back from an ethical dimension, and even lead humanity towards an ecological and warlike catastrophe. There is no self-sufficient civilization that has nothing to learn from another, and at the same time, there is no ignorant civilization that has nothing to teach. Even civilizations devoid of technology, without railways, without fortune, not industrialized can leave us with great wisdom and knowledge. Perhaps, if Europe had heeded and applied other ways of thinking and interpreting the concept of progress, perhaps the devastation, and the death of millions of people, in the great wars of the 20th century would have been spared. According to José Ingenieros, who writes the introduction to Sarmiento's book Conflict and Harmonies of the Races in America, he affirms that the author's words seem to come down from a Sinai, are words that cannot be questioned, they must be accepted as absolute truths, universal laws, almost religious. It is progress. The author of Conflict and Harmonies of Races in America, writes José Ingenieros, has wanted to give historical reality its true value in order to explain the strange aspects that free institutions made for peoples present in their application to South America. Some would say civilized, Christian, others will surname them, but in any case European, white heirs of the acquisitions of the centuries. Works, Volume XXXVII, p. 347. In his works, the influence of Hegel and Spencer is perceived in Sarmiento. With Spencer I understand myself, because we are walking the same path. Works, Volume XXXVII, p. 332. Sarmiento starts from an unquestionable and axiomatic belief that our original nations, which were already settled before the arrival of the Europeans, are an inferior race to the European, and therefore must disappear. Colonialism has built an enemy that was useful to justify and rationalize its expansionist interventions. He convinced himself that the main obstacle to the expansion of European and bourgeois civilization lay in a conflict of races. The white man had to expel the other races. Scientific racism has been constructed as such, and it was intended to empirically demonstrate that non-European races contaminated and hindered the immovable concepts of civilization and equality proper to the bourgeoisie. Appropriating the Darwinian theory of natural selection, and applying it socially and nationally,